What's up, everyone? Tera Roberts here with 444, and we are talking players to cut for Week 16. Week 15 hit us with another wave of injuries added on to the existing ones from Week 14. This has been a brutal year. We've got multiple quarterbacks in concussion protocol, receivers suffering injuries across the board, plus we have to prepare for streaming defenses. If you need to make cuts, I've got you covered. Before we get started, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and if you want more fantasy insights and tips, head over to 444.com/plans and sign up for a subscription today. And exclusively for our YouTube audience, use promo code YouTube at checkout to save 25%. Now let's go ahead and dive right in. First off, we're going to talk about Dameon Pierce. Those random 15 carries in Week 13 were a complete mirage. Dameon Pierce is a strong drop candidate. Outside of Week 13, Singletary has operated as the Texans' lead back since around Week 6. That's the point at which Singletary started to cut into Pierce's workload significantly and turn an already shaky backfield into Pierce really just being an unusable fantasy asset. And when Pierce suffered an injury and missed weeks 9 through 11, Singletary took the opportunity and literally ran with it, putting up numbers that we hadn't even come close to seeing with Pierce. The problem is twofold here. One, Dameon Pierce has been less productive than Devin Singletary in terms of his fantasy production per snap. This is very similar to what we talked about last month with Miles Sanders, and you see how that turned out. Devin Singletary produces 0.7 fantasy points per touch in PPR. Dameon Pierce produces just 0.49. It doesn't seem like a big gap, but it's pretty significant. He's just very ineffective compared to Devin Singletary. And again, much like Miles Sanders and Chuba Hubbard, when we talked about this before, Pierce and Singletary have the same touches per game over the course of the season, so there's no skewed statistics here. And even if Singletary suffered an injury this week and Pierce was the default lead back, would you really feel comfortable starting him? He's hit double-digit fantasy points in PPR just 3 times this season. Singletary has hit around 20 fantasy points 3 times over the past 6 weeks. Something just isn't clicking here with Pierce. Moving on to the next player. At this point, it is difficult to trust anyone in Washington outside of Curtis Samuel. Even Terry McLaurin was on track for another subpar performance before Jacoby Brissett came into the game. We've had Jahan Dotson on the list multiple times, and make no mistake, Dotson is absolutely still a cut candidate. But this week, we're going to focus on another commander. You can add Logan Thomas to the cut list as well. We were holding on to Logan Thomas because he was a very steady streaming option with high upside earlier in the season. But we've had way too many games in a row now with subpar performances and too many solid streaming options outperforming him that are very low rostered right now. We cannot roster Logan Thomas when guys like Hunter Henry, Gerald Everett, Tucker Kraft, and even Tanner Hudson are available on waivers. Yes, even a guy like Tanner Hudson has been more consistent, more reliable than Logan Thomas. Over the past 3 games, Thomas has had 3.5, 2, and 1.7 fantasy points. Many of us are still streaming tight ends in the playoffs. Maybe it was by design, or maybe it was because we were forced into it because we lost a starter. Either way, Logan Thomas is someone that we just can't trust. Moving on to the next player. With Chris Olave out, I expected Rashid Shaheed to step up and be the leader of the receiving corps. Instead, Shaheed had just 3 receptions on 4 targets for 36 yards with a snap count just at 58%. To be fair, he was coming off a 2-game absence, so it's possible that he was just being eased back in. No one really stepped up in the receiving corps, and targets were spread fairly evenly. The person who had the most receptions was actually Alvin Kamara, and that makes sense. Shaheed is talented, but he's a second-year receiver that's never really been utilized outside of that big play type of receiver. And he's great at it, don't get me wrong. But for now, that seems to be the only usage that he has. Olave was a game-time decision, so he'll likely return to action this week. Shaheed remains a risky boom-bust player like Gabe Davis, but his last boom game came in Week 8. You can move on. Now let's talk about some other cut candidates real quick that we've talked about before. Josh Downs. Michael Pittman exited the game fairly early, and it literally had 0 effect on Josh Downs. In fact, Downs actually saw the lowest snap count that he's had on the entire season outside of games where he was injured. Since returning to his normal capacity after injury, Downs has averaged just 6 fantasy points per game. It is Week 16. You are not starting a receiver that has shown no upside in 2 months. The last time that Downs had double-digit fantasy points was in Week 8. You can cut him. Khalil Herbert. We keep getting yanked back and forth on the Chicago running backs, and at this point, we can't feel confident in any of these backs. Last week, Roschon Johnson had the edge. The prior week, Donta Foreman had the edge. But there's one thing that feels very clear here. Khalil Herbert has the least upside out of all 3 backs. He's not the first option at the goal line. He has 0 rushing touchdowns on the year. He doesn't have receiving upside. He's just the odd man out in terms of fantasy production. You can cut him. And let's do one more. Jahan Dotson, we talked about it earlier. Again, no cut candidate hurts me more than Jahan Dotson. Such high hopes heading into the season, only for him to be the least productive receiver in Washington. Dotson simply cannot succeed with Curtis Samuel. When Curtis Samuel is out or limited, Jahan Dotson scores touchdowns. When Curtis Samuel is healthy, Dotson has a ceiling of 10 fantasy points and a floor of 0. He has had multiple games with 0 fantasy points. You cannot trust him. You can cut him. That wraps things up. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like the video and comment below as well. And if you want more fantasy insights and tips, head over to 4for4.com/plans and sign up for a subscription today. And exclusively for our YouTube audience, use promo code YouTube at checkout to save 25%.